What's going on? It's Ed here from Geek, and I'm here with Marcel Petitpas. How are you today?
I'm doing great, Ed. Thanks for having me, man.
Absolutely. So, when was that? When were we in Atlanta? Was that October or September?
Yeah, it's like a month ago.
About a month ago in Atlanta. We were at Carl Allen's Protege event, which is a business buying group. And Marcel spoke about really dialing in your numbers for professional service companies, agencies, insurance agencies, anyone that offers professional services. He got up and you literally couldn't pick people's jaws up off the floor fast enough. It was pretty eye-opening for a good portion of the audience. So as soon as it was over, ran up to Marcel, I was like, dude, we got to get you on the channel. I feel like the people that watch our channel would greatly benefit from hearing what it is that you do and your approach to business. So let's get into it. Marcel, who are you? What do you do? Give us a little bit of background.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'm grateful for the platform, the ability to get on the show here. And yeah, it was great meeting you in Atlanta, and I'm glad we're able to make this happen. Like you mentioned, my specialization is really in helping professional services businesses measure and increase their profitability. And we have a particular focus. I run a firm called Parakeeto, and we are a software-enabled consulting firm. And this is what we do. We come in and we help particularly agencies, but more broadly professional services companies, really get a grip on their numbers and figure out how profitable they could be with their current business model, how to adapt their business model to be more profitable, why they're not reaching their full profit potential, and then we help them measure and systematically improve their profitability through a combination of reporting and coaching on an ongoing basis. So that at a high level is what we do, and it's what I've been exclusively focused on for about 5 years now.
Okay, cool. So let's make up a ABC agency. They come to you, they say, we're making some money. We're on a W-2 salary. You get a distribution at the end of the year. Life is good. But you have this inkling in the back of your brain saying, I think things could be better. I think I'm not running the ship as tightly as I possibly could. What happens next? How does this process work?
So I want to just double click on the example a little bit, because we do hear from those agencies sometimes, and I call those our kind of high performer clients, where they're coming to us because they want an edge, they want to be better. And it makes sense to me that that's your framing, Ed, because I see you as being one of those people where you have a good business, but you're always trying to figure out how to make it great. Most of the people that we talk to, though, the story sounds more like we've tripled our revenue in the last 3 years, and I'm personally making less money as a founder. And I don't know why. And it feels like no matter how hard we work, no matter how big we get, no matter how many hours I ask my team to work, we're always struggling with cash flow. We're never really getting the amount of profitability that we want. And if I'm honest, it's kind of a black box and I can't really figure out what's going on. I sit down with my accountant every month. He shows me the numbers. They don't look good, but we have no idea what we actually need to do every day to fix this. What are the decisions that we're making that are the wrong ones? What should we be focused on? That's really what they come to us with, feeling like they don't have control over their profitability, essentially, and they don't have the clarity to know what they can do to improve it.
Got it. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So I was having this conversation earlier today about a CPA versus a financial strategist or fractional CFO or whatever it is you want to refer to someone that really dives into the business of numbers as opposed to the reporting of numbers. So can you kind of talk about how you're a bit different than just your normal run-of-the-mill CPA as opposed to filing?
Yeah, for sure. So essentially what we do at Parakeeto is we bridge the gap between finance and the operations of the business, right? And so the experience that most of us have, if we are in a business where we're relying mostly on our financials to tell us how the business is doing, we're getting a report usually a few weeks after the month is over, sometimes 3-4 weeks later. We look backwards and we go, oh, cool, we didn't make as much money as we wanted. And then we can sometimes get a little bit of insight into why that is. Oh, our gross margin is not that good. But that's usually where the insight stops. And the cost of trying to get further insight, like, what's our profitability by service line or by project, right? We start to get into these kinds of much more advanced forms of accounting. It's extremely complicated. It's extremely expensive. And unfortunately, that information just doesn't get any timelier. In fact, usually adding that complexity is the reason that instead of getting a 2-week reconciliation, we're now getting pushed back to 3 or 4 or 5 weeks because there's so much more work that needs to get done in order to reconcile the books. So our job is to really get an understanding of what is your business's capability for profitability, and start to bridge the gap between the decisions that you make every day about people, projects, and time, your sales pipeline, how you price things, how you scope things, and how those decisions impact the financial outcome of the business. So you know ahead of time what the P&L is going to look like, and you know ahead of time what the impact of a decision is going to be on the profitability of the business. So like if we hire this person tomorrow, how is that going to change our revenue targets? And how many hours we have available to sell, and how much capacity we have and our projected utilization. Or conversely, if we get a new client, how is that going to impact our capacity and our planned utilization and how close we are to our revenue targets? These things that change every single day, that's the stuff that we focus on measuring, so that the financials become less of a crutch or less of an important thing for you to rely on, and they become much more predictable because you have control over the things that happen in the business that actually lead to that outcome. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah. And the older I get, the wiser I get, the more I realize that your particular skill set is one of the superpowers in business. It bores the shit out of a lot of people, but once you can dial it in and show people how to operate within those frameworks, it's a pretty life-altering experience, and it's eye-opening. So talk to me about, you mentioned utilization. In one of your talks, or in the talk you gave in Atlanta, you talked about utilization as a rate and factoring in people's time off and vacation and sick days. And can you kind of walk through like what the framework of what you think about utilization for a team member?
Yeah. I'll zoom out just a little bit before we dive into that and talk really about kind of the three main levers that we see be most impactful in profitability in a services company. Most of the time, so we do a lot of audits. That's kind of the first thing we do when we bring on a new client. We go through and we figure out what they could be doing, what they're currently doing, where the gaps are. And the issue is almost never that they're like spending a ton of money on overhead, that they have like, they're renting the most expensive office in New York City. Everybody has a $900 Aeron chair. They hire like the most expensive consultants for accounting and legal. That's almost never the case. The case is pretty much always that their gross margin just isn't high enough. So basically it's costing them too much money to get the work done for clients that they're being paid for. And so there's just not that much money left over to pay for their overhead and have a profit. And there's three things that impact that gross margin. The first is their delivery costs, which is most easily measured through what we call average cost per hour. So that's answering the question of, for every hour that we spend doing work for clients, what does it cost us on average for that hour of labor? And then the two levers that impact the revenue that labor cost can generate is average billable rate, which asks the question, for every hour that we spend doing work for clients, on average, how much revenue do we earn? Regardless of the pricing model, whether we bill flat rates or we bill hourly, we have retainers, we have projects, doesn't matter. We're just dividing money by time. And then the last one is utilization. So out of all the time that I'm buying from this team of people that make up my company, what percentage of their time is spent earning that dollar per hour value or doing work for clients? And so I think the magic of what we do at Parakeeto is we figured out a framework that is perfectly consistent. And this is one of the things that if you've ever tried to solve this problem of measuring things like utilization and average billable rate and average cost per hour, and then trying to connect the dots to your financials, there's all these little micro questions that are often not thought about on the surface, but when you get into the weeds, you start to be like, okay, well, if I'm going to measure someone's utilization, which is the formula for that is how many delivery hours or billable hours did they spend divided by their capacity. When we start double clicking on those two metrics, there's a lot of really small, confusing micro questions. So what is somebody's capacity? What does it include? What does it not include? Does it include vacation time? Does it include paid time off? Does it include holidays and sick time? And what exactly is a billable hour? Does it matter if we actually bill the client for it, or is it just time that was spent on the work? And does it include things that are productive, but that don't generate, client revenue for the business, like working on the website or posting to our social media? And what I've found is almost every agency measures these things differently. And almost nobody in that company has taken the time to zoom out and ask the question, how does the way I measure this metric impact how I need to measure all the other metrics so they're actually consistent with one another? And therein lies kind of one of the core fundamental problems. So I wanted to kind of frame this up before I go into my explanation of utilization, because it's probably going to be different than how a lot of people measure it. And it's not to say that this is the right way to do it, but this is the way that is consistent with every other metric that we measure as part of our framework That's why we get to measure it this way. So you might hear some things when I explain this where you go, well, that doesn't make sense. You're not accounting for this thing or that thing. And I promise you, we are accounting for it. We're just probably accounting for it somewhere else.
Yep.
And in a way that makes this whole thing less complicated, less expensive to measure, et cetera. So it's a little tangent. I'm going to take a breather here before I dig into the actual question you asked.
And I appreciate you said it may be different than the way you do it, meaning me, or the listener, but it is accounted for. One thing I noticed during your presentation was that you talk about, I believe the word was agency gross revenue or agency, what was the
agency gross income is what we call it. Yeah.
Agency gross income. Yeah. So removing out pass-through expenses, maybe not even like companies that take in ad budget, which I think is always the sketchy way to become a $10 million agency.
Yes.
But even things like CallRail and Instapage and different services that you're using, not putting it under cost of goods sold, putting it under above that to get you to a true utilization number, I thought was really interesting. So let me know when you got your breather and you're good to go.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so let's dig into that. So maybe we'll start with the financials at a high level. So one of the things you mentioned is really important, right? We like to differentiate between revenue and what we call agency gross income. And what we do in order to isolate that is exactly what you said. We isolate what we call pass-through expenses. So that's money that's flowing through your business as an agency that isn't actually yours, and you're not responsible for the profitability of that money. So ad spend is a great example. But to your point, you might be passing through things and marking them up to clients. Like you might buy website templates. You might have stock footage libraries. You might be passing through a software expense, a CRM, a landing page builder, whatever, hosting. Those are things that pass through your business onto the client. Now, again, you might mark them up. That's fine. That markup you're going to keep. That's going to flow through to agency gross income. But the expense of those hard costs, you want to isolate and strip out so that what's left over is the money that is actually left to pay for you and your time and your team's time. That's your real revenue as an agency. And that's what we want to measure and benchmark your profitability against, because that's really what you now need to spend your time and money to earn. So that's the first thing. That gets you to agency gross income. Most people, when they look at the profit and loss statement, pass-through expenses are going to be isolated using cost of goods sold. So the thing that's called gross profit is actually their agency gross income. And that's fine. I don't have an issue with that at all. Like, I'm not going to tell an accountant how to structure their books. They could do it however they want. It just should be clear that that's actually what that number represents. So I'll leave it at that. So then you have your agency gross income. And then what you need to isolate is your delivery costs, right? What does it cost you to earn that revenue? And that's generally going to be a function of mostly the salaries that you pay to the people whose job is to come in and get that work done every day. And what you're trying to get to is a 50% margin. So you don't want to spend more than 50 cents to earn $1 of revenue. What that means is you have a 50 cents left over from every dollar that a client pays you after you've given them everything you promised. That gives you enough money to pay for overhead, which is going to be another 20 or 30% of the business. And then you should have 20 to 30% left over. So that's kind of the critical financials. So we talked about those three levers that really help you improve that margin and get you to 50% or higher. Utilization is a key one. And the way we measure utilization, as I mentioned before, delivery hours or billable hours over capacity. The way we would measure utilization is the simplest possible way to do it, which really takes a lot of project managers off. But again, it's not because we're missing a bunch of information. We're just trying to do it in an efficient way. Capacity is total capacity, gross capacity. So for most people, that's 2,080 hours per year, or 52 weeks multiplied by 40 hours a week. And immediately there's somebody saying, well, Marcel, people don't work 52 hours a year. They get vacation time and paid time off and sick days and holidays, et cetera. You're right. They don't. But we want to leave all of that stuff in capacity because we want to measure the cost of that in the utilization rate. And if we start to strip that out of someone's capacity, then the more time off they take, the more holidays they get, the more sick time that they take, the higher their utilization rate will be. And in our framework for how we use utilization, that would be an indicator that our profitability is increasing. But that's the opposite of what's actually happening. So we shouldn't measure it in that way because that becomes a false positive. So we want to measure it in the simplest way possible, which is their total capacity. And then we want to measure a delivery hour as any time spent doing client work. It doesn't matter if they were billed for it, if it increased or lowered the price. And what doesn't count is stuff that is productive but isn't client work. So working on the company website, That's productive, but that's not a delivery hour. That doesn't move revenue from your balance sheet to the P&L. It doesn't get the deliverable move forward for the client, so it doesn't count. Managing the company social media doesn't count, unfortunately. All this internal stuff, that stuff is not considered a delivery hour. So that is how we would measure utilization. And it's dead simple. And again, it factors the cost of all of this essentially not delivery time, and it factors in the cost of holidays and vacation, et cetera. But it's also really inexpensive to measure now because you don't have to keep track of all of these other tangential data points in order to get a read on utilization in a given period of time.
Got it. Okay. In your presentation, you walk through a few case studies of people that implemented your style of accounting and deep analysis of the numbers, prescribed a solution, and took them from A to B or A to Z. Can you walk through some examples of what's possible once you know the numbers at a granular level?
Yeah. So, I mean, there's a couple of really incredible stories. And I recently sent an email to our list where I had to kind of recount some of these things. So, one story that I absolutely love is a firm that came to us. They had shifted their business model to be more of a white label agency. They had been really successful prior to that, and they had a thesis. They wanted to be more of a white label team. So they kind of pivoted the agency. They built out a bunch of infrastructure, built out a big team, and they were like, we're going to grow into this and we're going to grow into profitability. We're going to lose some money for a couple of years, but we're going to be fine. The founder called me 3 years in. They had been losing $1 million plus per year for 3 straight years. And he was like, I'm starting to think that we can't grow out of this because our revenue is going up, but this profit gap is just really not closing. And to be honest, I don't know what the problem is. I can't figure this out. In 3 weeks, we were able to take them through our process, show them exactly why they were where they were, and how to get to $1.2 million in EBITDA within 12 months without increasing their pricing, without cutting any overhead costs, without firing anyone on their staff, and without asking anyone to work crazy hours. We were able to show them where the gap was. And the gap was, it was a utilization gap where their team was really busy, but they were doing a whole bunch of stuff that wasn't delivery. And there was some over servicing happening where they were busy doing things that weren't in scope, over servicing their clients. And so just by like slightly correcting their over servicing, they were able to get their average billable rate up to where it actually needed to be. And by taking a lot of the kind of not billable work off of their team's plate, they were able to handle a lot more revenue with the team that they had without asking them to work any more hours than they already were. And that combination of little things that didn't seem that material, it's a 10, 15% average billable rate increase. It's a 5 or 6% utilization increase at a company of that scale, resulted in a massive turnaround, almost $2.5 million of bottom line profit for this business over the course of a year. So that's just like one example of the kind of turnaround that we can show when we really get precise about what's happening operationally that's leading to the financial outcome.
Wild. Take them from $1 million to 2.5 in 12 months is pretty spectacular. Talk to me about other companies that are potentially losing money that you've walked through the process and turn things around.
Yeah, we had another client that came to us. They were on track to lose 600K that year. They had grown really, really quickly through COVID. That was it was a good time for them because of the services that they sold, and they were, kind of in the e-commerce space, which had done really well through COVID. But it's one of those stories where it's like we're growing, but we're not necessarily growing in the right way. And we were able to get them in the black within 90 days. So that was like a literal. They went from burning tens of thousands of dollars a month to being in the black within 90 days, and now they're on track to do over 800K in EBITDA for their fiscal year, and we're 18 months into working with them. So another pretty dramatic turnaround. And again, they did increase their price, but it was a small increase. I think they increased it by, it wasn't even 25%, maybe like a 15 or 18% increase to their rate. Most of their gain in profitability came from just like dialing in over servicing, working out some clients' indigestion. So this is one of the things about firms that do a lot of recurring work, and they did have a lot of recurring kind of retainer work, is you pay for indigestion on an ongoing basis and you benefit from improvements on an ongoing basis. So there's this really powerful compounding nature to recurring work. And a lot of firms that do a lot of recurring work, they experience a lot of indigestion. They just can't see it. And so with this firm in particular,
unpack that? What does that mean exactly?
Yeah. So I'll give you another example. we worked with a firm. We were able to grow their revenue 60% year over year and increase their profit by 500% year over year without actually increasing the number of clients they served, without hiring a single team member, without cutting their overhead costs, without changing their pricing. What had happened with them is these were two of the founders that came to me and said, we've tripled our business and we're making less money and we don't know what's going on. And what had happened was all of their work was recurring. They only did retainers. And they just had a bunch of clients that they just weren't making money on. In fact, some of their clients were costing them money. So they had revenue coming in, but the amount of time and energy that went into delivering for those clients had just kind of, you know, it had been cut from both sides. The scope kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger because, you know, every couple of months they ask for this extra little thing. And then all of a sudden you compound that over a couple of years, you're doing twice as much work for them as you had originally agreed to. And you never really quite increased the price enough to justify it. And so when we started doing analysis on average billable rate for customer, which is something we do with all of our recurring clients, we look at how much do you get paid? How much time does it take to service this client? And then you can see for every single client, what is the amount of money per hour that we make from this client that we invest? And very quickly, you'll start to realize some clients you make amazing money on. It takes very little time. They're very happy and you're killing it. And other clients, it's like this bottomless pit where you just keep pouring time in and you're just not getting paid for it. So once we identified that, we started doing a strategy with them that we call revenue replacement. So what they were doing to grow to that level, every time they would sell a new client, they would add that client on top of the pile. And then they always felt like they were behind. Their team is busy. They need to hire more people. So it's like their revenue was going up, but their costs were going up at the same rate. We said, okay, next time you sell a new client with new terms and new pricing that you're happy with, go to your worst client and try to renegotiate the contract. If they leave, no problem. You replace them with the new client. If they say yes, you move up to the next one and renegotiate. And you continue that process until you've gotten rid of all the indigestion in the business. And in doing that, they were able to, again, with the same team, the same resources, the same overhead, replace all the bad quality revenue that was causing them indigestion with new higher quality revenue. And for every hour they spent, on average, they earned way more money. And that's how they kind of grew their revenue and dramatically improved their profitability. So it was just about saying, like, let's pause on getting bigger for a while and focus on getting better. And once we have all the indigestion taken care of, then we can get back to growing in the right way.
Indigestion. Got it. Okay. So how do you coach your clients to have that difficult conversation with their client where they suck as a client? How do you have a conversation without ruffling feathers and burning bread?
Well, that's the funny thing is often it's not that they're bad clients.
Yep.
It's usually that we just haven't done a great job of managing expectations. And, you know, we were just so focused on growth and other things that we just weren't paying attention to those things eroding. And so the way that I have typically approached that conversation is you just approach the client and you say, look, Ed, we love working with you. We're grateful for your business. We want to continue to serve you. Unfortunately, we're in a position where it's not sustainable for us to deliver on what you need with the scope that we have. And in order to continue to serve you as well as possible, like this is what is going to need to be true. And often you want to try to coincide that with a change in scope. So it's not like, because nobody likes to have the conversation of like, we're going to give you the same thing, but we're going to charge you more money for it now all of a sudden. It's more about saying like, hey, your needs have changed since we started working together, but the way that we work together and the scope of what we do together hasn't. So we want to reset, make sure that we know what your expectations are. We can support you, do all the new things that you need us to do, and that we have the bandwidth to do a good job of that. And if we can't figure out a way to work together, we've got a couple of other agencies we think that would be great that we can happily refer you to. And that just kind of sets a realistic set of expectations. It allows you to kind of set the frame and say, like, we're here from a place of service. We want to support you, but here's what needs to be true for us to do a good job of that. And if that doesn't work for you, it's no hard feelings. We've really enjoyed working together and like, we're happy to help you find the next fit.
What a way better way to explain that to a client than what I was thinking in my head. So I appreciate
yeah. Most people, you know, will be blunt about it. And that sometimes works too, which is just like, hey man, like, you know, like we're just not getting paid enough money for all the stuff that you're doing. And that works, but I take a bit of a softer touch.
Let me ask you a question. So for ours, we run a flat fee model, but there may be clients that have an exorbitant amount of support requests or just lag or pull on support. How do you factor in that when they're submitting forms into help scout or want phone calls? Like, how do you account for the need for support in a flat fee model, and then the
Yeah.
outliers thereof?
So there's two ways to structure that. And this is where there's a framework that I didn't share in Atlanta, but people really enjoy that I share a lot. And actually, if I do this, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. Is it inverted or is it right side up?
No, you're good. Yep.
Okay. So I'll share just.
You can share if you want. Let me just do manage sharing. Let's see how I would do that.
Yeah, I can do
If
that.
you be able to share
I
if you.
don't think I can do my iPad, but I'll just do it this way if that's cool. And you can
Okay.
pull it on the recording.
Good.
So like the way I think about pricing for agencies, because this is really it's a question of price and it's a question of scope, right? Because the concern here that I think you're expressing is if I'm on a flat fee, but the scope is just like completely getting out of hand, how do I deal with that? And
That's the scope. It's the support scope.
right,
That's the issue that is
right.
causing the issue. Like the work being done behind the scenes is the same from a deliverable standpoint, but then it's the suck on going back into the account, back into the account, back into the
Yeah.
account that is killing it.
Yeah, and you're right. So it's that support scope, which is still, it's part of the cost of delivery. And that's just the thing that has, it sounds like, more risk associated to it. So this is kind of how I think about pricing. Side tangent, I think that the conversation about pricing models for agencies lacks nuance, and it really ticks me off. Because most people that talk about pricing for agencies, they're trying to sell you one pricing model. And so that's their hammer and everything is a nail. And they make you feel like you're an idiot if you do anything other than productized services or value-based pricing or whatever. And they don't really acknowledge the reality of services, which is sometimes there's risk and sometimes you can't predict what it's going to take. And stuff like this happens where you have these runaway trains and you're eating it if you have a flat fee and you haven't priced in that risk. So the things you got to consider when you're thinking about pricing is value, of course. So on this axis, I call this our pricing model quadrant. You have high value work. And on this end, you have low value work. Sorry, I can't write today. Low value. And then you got to think about risk. So you have low risk work over here and you have high risk work. So I'll explain what these mean. High risk, low risk. So risk is what is it going to cost you to do this work? And if something's low risk, usually you can get within 10% of the cost to deliver that work to a client. High risk is, there's an unlimited amount of uncertainty that you could get to here, but like let's just say you're not really able to predict how much it's going to cost you to do this. In some cases, the process you're selling might be inherently iterative. So like agile is a good example of this. It would be anti-agile to try and scope a project up front that you're going to apply the agile methodology to, because the whole point of that methodology is we're going to do some work, we're going to learn what we learn, and then we're going to adapt, and then we're going to do more work, and we're just going to continually adapt to what we're learning to try and deliver the business outcomes that we need. And it might take 3 cycles to do that. It might take 30 cycles to do that. So how do you account and price for something where it's like you can't even begin to predict what it's going to cost? And that's kind of a foreign thing to a lot of people that talk about pricing in the industry. So that's the first thing you got to be thinking about. And then the second thing that is not so novel is value. And it's like, what does the client perceive your service to be in terms of value? And the two things that influence this are typically going to be your positioning and your positioning and the relative value to the client. So positioning would be like, we are a design firm. Well, that's going to put you in a pretty low value category because there's a lot of design firms out there that sell graphic design services. You're competing with everyone from IDEO to Canva and everything in between. Whereas if you said we specialize in graphic design for home service companies to help them attract and convert more customers, then you're going to be on a much higher value axis, because if a home service company is looking for a designer to help them convert more customers, then you're going to have a much more specific positioning. The second thing is relative value. So like if you do conversion rate optimization, a 1% conversion rate increase is worth way more to apple.com than it is to, your local, I don't know, your local e-commerce shop or your local shoe store that sells $200 a month worth of shoes online. So you got to think about the relativity there as well. So the way I think about this is for low value, high risk work, typically you're going to go hourly or time and materials. The reason you do this is because you're selling time. So if it takes way more time than you expected, it's fine. You're still getting paid for your time. And it's low value. So typically your hourly rate is going to be low because your labor cost is low. So that it allows you to create the perception of value, even if the aggregate price is still actually quite high. On the low value, low risk side, this is typically where you're going to use flat rates. And the example I use here a lot is, if you came to me and you said, Marcel, I need you to build me a website. And I said, it's going to be $500 an hour. You might tell me to go pound sand. But if I tell you, hey, no problem, I can get you a blazing fast website in 2 weeks. It's proven to optimize. It's proven to convert. It's optimized for your industry, and I'll get it to you in 2 weeks for $5,000. You might say, actually, that sounds like a great deal. Where do I sign? Now, because it's low risk, I might still make $500 an hour because I spend 10 hours to do that website. You're none the wiser. We both win. And I can do that because there's low risk. So I arbitrage the low risk. I take on that risk with a flat fee. I create certainty and a perception of value for you as the client, and I can increase my rate because of this. Now, the problem is when you're here, you have high risk, low value, but you're still pricing on a flat rate. That flat rate needs to be high enough to absorb the risk. So in your case, Ed, the question I would ask you is, what's the heuristic on support? If you have 100 clients, what percentage of those clients have a significantly higher amount of support? And in aggregate, what is the average billable rate? And it's very possible that, yes, those couple of outliers are frustrating, but in aggregate, actually, we end up on the right side of that equation when we normalize that.
We definitely do. Like there's an 80-20 and then an 80-20 of the 80-20. So it's a 96-4. Like you can definitely see it in Help Scout of who's drawing. Is that just the cost of doing business, or do you try to cycle out those outliers and then bring in a fresh group? What's the methodology there?
I think it depends on, again, your thesis. So we'll take a pause on that and I'll get back to this. So if your thesis is that I'm pricing the risk into my flat rate, then yes, that's a cost of doing business. And you would tackle that operationally. So you might look at, okay, well, what's causing these support tickets? Can we address the underlying issues? Can we create more self-service options? Can we start to replace or kind of push these clients out? The other way to do it, though, is to say, okay, this is not a part of my pricing model. It's not something that I'm pricing in on my flat rate. What's a mechanism that I can use to control this? This is where we get into a pricing model that's common in the high risk, high value spectrum, which I call abstracted time and materials. And this is a pricing model that's used by, for example, Design Pickle, where you might have wondered, like, how does Design Pickle offer, air quotes, unlimited graphic design for $400 a month? Like, how could they possibly be making money doing that? And the reason is because they don't actually sell you unlimited graphic design for $400 a month. They sell you a quarter of a designer in Mexico for $400 a month. And you can ask them for as many deliverables as you want, but you only get so many per week. You only get so much of their time per week. So you could do the same thing with your support tickets if you find that that's an issue, where for the $500 a month or the $1,000 a month, whatever they're paying you, they get this much support velocity per week. So if they submit 15 tickets, the due date on that ticket, that last ticket, just gets pushed back based on how many tickets your team can process per week. And then your account manager calls them and says, hey, I'm noticing you're looking for a lot of support. I'm worried that we're not going to get that support to you quickly enough on your current plan. Would you like to upgrade to a higher plan so we can dedicate more resources to your account and make sure that you get the support that you need? And that is, if you asked a Design Pickle designer for 100 deliverables in 2 days, I promise you would get that call from your account manager at Design Pickle, and they would try to upsell you to a higher plan. So that's another mechanism, is to kind of use this backlog and a velocity concept to create some anchors for your pricing, and timelines become the thing that you can use to really modulate scope.
Got it. That makes sense. Okay.
So I'll finish this because people watching, if they're like me, if I don't fill in this last box, they'll have an aneurysm. So abstracted time materials is like I said, it's abstracting away from hours, but you still have hours as the underlying pricing mechanic, which is why it allows you to absorb more risk. So other examples of this would be like Media Monks. They're leasing you a cross-functional website design and development team for $10,000 per 2-week sprint. And they're going to express the estimate for your big enterprise website build as a function of sprints. So like, hey, we think this is going to take 20 to 26 sprints for the current backlog. What's beautiful about this pricing model for really complex stuff that's hard to predict or that's inherently iterative is the answer to any client request for something new or different is yes, and do you want this before or after the other stuff that's in the backlog? And because they're paying you for time and sprints at a certain velocity, you're incentivized to actually say yes to everything because that's just going to add sprints onto the end of the project. And most firms that work this way, it ends up being these kind of long-term leases of teams. And as long as they price their margin into that team structure, they're good. They don't have to worry about the scope changing. So it's great for that kind of situation where the scope's going to be all over the place. That's okay. It can help absorb it. The last piece here is high value, high risk. This is value-based pricing. The simplest form of value-based pricing looks a lot like a flat rate, except we go back to the previous example. If you asked me to build you a website, instead of telling you the website's $5,000, I would ask you a question. I would say, well, tell me more about the website. What's it for? Oh, it's for your business. How big is your business? And how many visitors do you get? And what's the average value of a customer? Oh, interesting. So if we can increase your conversion rate by 10%, that would add $10 million to your business next year. Fascinating. Well, how about we charge you 10% of that potential upside to build you a new website? So now instead of anchoring the price to the deliverable, we're anchoring the price more to the value that that deliverable creates. And we can try to create outsized pricing for that. But the important thing to remember here is we still need to be able to predict what it's going to cost us. Doesn't matter how much we increase our price. If our scope increases relatively, we're not really realizing much benefit from that. And there is a more advanced form of pricing here, which is what we would call performance-based, where we take on even more risk, and we not only need to de-risk the scope, we also need to de-risk the outcome. So examples of this would be like pay per lead, or we get a commission on sales, or we get compensated based on hitting some kind of a target. This is very advanced. Very few firms can do this because you have to be able to measure that stuff too. So that's kind of how I think about pricing models and how to think about really risk along with value so that you can actually balance those things in the way that you price.
Got it.
Is that helpful, Ed? I know that was a much longer answer to the question that you asked.
I was glued to the screen. I love it. Talk to me about your thinking on in-house versus outsourced talent deliverables.
Yeah, I like both. I'll tell you what I've observed. The most profitable agencies that we've audited in the last couple of years are the ones that have really understood their core competency and pushed things that are not their core competency to external people and external teams and white label partners. And I think that this is the future of the agency business. Like the last 10 years, we've been really focused on specialization. I feel like that's the thing everyone's been talking about is you got to niche down, you got to specialize, you got to have a specific target market, specific, problem that you solve, which is great. I agree. I think everybody should do that. But now everybody is doing that. It's become table stakes. What's the next frontier? Because the pressure on our margins isn't going anywhere. It's just getting worse now, especially with the entrance of AI. I think the next place that we're going to go is what I call internal specialization. So that's really looking at the inside of the business and saying, as operators, what are our strengths? What are the things that we're passionate about, we're really good at? What are the things we're not? And let's double down on the things that we're great at. And let's partner with other agencies, other people, other contractors, et cetera, that are good at the stuff we're not good at. And a good example of this is a firm that we audited that did a lot of SEO work. They really focused on selling, client management, and strategy. And pretty much all of the execution they would give to a white label partner. So they were giving up, anywhere from 50 to 30% of their revenue to that white label partner. But what was left over was unbelievably profitable because it was all the highest value stuff and they were really good at it. So I'm a big fan of having a good mix of full-time staff for the stuff that is really core to your value proposition, really core to your unique perspective, your point of view, and that is close to the highest value parts of the engagement, which are client relationship, strategy, right? And some novel execution, and partnering with other people, contractors, freelancers for everything else. In particular, when you're in a situation where you have a lot of turbulence or uncertainty around volume or demand. Because the cost of having to deal with fluctuations in utilization when you have a full-time employee is significant, and you're often better off paying a slightly higher average cost per hour for outsourced labor that you now don't have to worry about utilizing on a consistent basis. And you tend to be more clear-headed about decisions like bringing on a client that's not really a good fit, doing a bunch of work and projects that aren't really a good fit or aren't really the direction you want to take the business in, hanging on to old clients that are really a pain in the butt and keep you up at night and drain your team's energy, right? You tend to be more objective about those kinds of decisions when you're not constantly worried about keeping a team of people busy, and you've created more redundancy in the business through that more flexible kind of outsourced labor. So at a high level, that's kind of my thinking around it. I think more agencies are going to lean into it, and I think it's appropriate. I think a lot more should.
Got it. Okay. Talk to me about who your avatar client is. How big are they? Where's your bread and butter?
Yeah, our perfect fit client is kind of in that 20 to 60 headcount range. So they're usually doing anywhere from 2 to 3 million on the low end up to 15 million on the high end. And really they come and find us when they need this information of, what kind of projects are performing well, who on my team's busy, the forecast, like when are we going to need to hire, who we're going to hire, and how does that change if we add or remove clients and projects. They need answers to those questions, but they don't have the resources to build like a full data operation or to have like a person full-time dedicated to this. And so that's typically when they come to find us and they say, like, we need help getting this information so we can empower our team, we can build a leadership team, we can hold everyone accountable, and do it without wasting a bunch of time and energy. So that's typically our best fit. And the services they offer are going to range all over the place, but the common thread is they typically do some kind of design or development on websites.
Got it. Okay. If someone does come in and they're below, let's say, like at or below $1 million in revenue, is that someone you could help, or is it someone you pass off to another agency?
Yeah. We've worked with firms as low as $500,000 in revenue, and we do have some lower cost options. Like our full service is probably going to be a little bit out of reach for them, but we do have some more self-serve options that they can work with us on. So really, anyone that's, I would say, 750K in revenue, closing in on that or passing through that, then you should reach out and have the conversation, and we can probably help. And if we can't, I will be helpful as a human being and point you in the right direction.
Awesome. Okay. If people want to learn more, give me some ideas of what they should be doing, what they should be watching, what they should be downloading.
Yeah. Well, I recommend everybody go check out the Agency Profit Toolkit. It's full of free videos, resources, templates, all kinds of stuff to help you implement the basics of, measuring these important KPIs in your agency. It's absolutely free. So you can grab that at parakeeto.com/toolkit. And of course, if you want to listen to more content like this about these kinds of topics, then I encourage you to check out our podcast, the Agency Profit Podcast, where we kind of get really nerdy and talk about this kind of stuff.
Yep. I'm going to show it real quick. I'm a viewer, or a listener rather. That's it right there.
There it is.
That's it.
Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Awesome. Well, I'm gonna stop the recording now. I'm gonna drop links to everything below. Or is there anything that you want to add in before we wrap up?
I just want to articulate that I think a lot of people have insecurity about not feeling comfortable or confident in their knowledge of this area of the business. And I just want you to know that this is actually really complicated. Like, it sounds simple in principle, but in practice, it's really hard. And you'd be amazed at how big agencies get without ever really figuring this out. So just know that you're not alone. It doesn't mean that you're not a good founder, you're not a good agency owner, you're not a smart person. It's okay that maybe you're not comfortable with all this stuff, and there's resources out there that are free, like ours, to help. So just I just want to articulate that. Don't feel bad if you feel like this is an area of the business that you're not comfortable in.
I certainly appreciate that, and I think I'd echo that. It's not just agencies; it's business in general. We were at a business buying event. That's where we met. And if you survey the audience of business owners, of companies, people at the event were trying to buy, I would think that majority of this is true there as well, where they don't have a strong handle on the numbers. So it's not just agency related. I think it's business in general, where there's just this big gap between true operational numbers and a depth of analysis that we're just not getting from at the CPA level. That's more just a retroactive filing, so you don't get in trouble, rather than a forward-looking forecasting and troubleshooting to figure out what's going on. So I appreciate that you said that at the end, and it's not just agencies. I think that's business in general, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's hard stuff, but thankfully there's nerds like me that think about it all day long, so you don't have to.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to stop the recording. Give me 1 sec.